Nervous system. Nervous system consists of two main parts: central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. And you must have heard of another entity of the nervous system called autonomic nervous system. Actually, this autonomic nervous system also comes under the peripheral nervous system. So, while considering the nervous system, central nervous system means the part of the nervous system that belongs to the center of the body. Peripheral nervous system means the part of the nervous system that goes peripherally from the central region. So, our nervous system is a highly complex part of an animal that coordinate the action and sensory information. It is performing its function by transmitting signals to and from different parts of the body. Well, taking this central nervous system, we know the part of the nervous system that is present in the center of the body are the brain and the spinal cord, because brain is located inside the cranial cavity and the spinal cord in the vertebral column. Both these structures are present in the midline. While the peripheral nervous system belongs to peripheral part of the body, these includes the nerves arising from the brain as well as spinal cord. So the cranial nerve and the spinal nerve are forming part of the peripheral nervous system. Autonomic nervous system is also a part of the peripheral nervous system, which consists of sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. If you're taking the subdivision of the brain, developmentally the nervous system is formed from a neural tube. So when a fetus develops, it has a neural tube. It develops a neural tube from the ectoderm, and this neural tube has a swelling in the cranial end. That is the area which is destined to develop into brain. And the caudal part or the remaining part of the neural tube will be slender, and that later develop to form spinal cord. So when this neural tube formed in the fetus, its cranial part becomes swelled up and the caudal part is narrow. This narrow caudal part later forms a spinal cord, and this swelled region later forms the brain. Later, when this brain, this swelled region, which is destined to develop into brain, is forming three more dilatations. The first being prosencephalon or forebrain, second one is mesencephalon or midbrain, and the third one is rhombencephalon or hindbrain. And the later part is a slender, this region, which later forms a spinal cord. So the brain, the part of the brain develops into three vesicles: a prosencephalon, mesencephalon and rhombencephalon. Later, the prosencephalic area develops into two lateral vesicles as well as a central region. So two lateral region as well as a central region. These lateral vesicles, which is developed from the prosencephalon, are called the telencephalon, and the central region formed from this prosencephalon is called diencephalon. So prosencephalon is again divided into telen as well as dielen. Mesencephalon remains as such. There is no further change for the mesencephalon or the midbrain, while the rhombencephalon or the hindbrain develops into meten and myelin. These are the subdivisions which is formed from the three dilatations of the brain, the vesicle of brain. So, prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhombencephalon. Prosen into telen and dielen. Mesen has no change. Rhomben into meten and myelin. Later, we can see prosen, telen and dielen. Telen that later forms the cerebral cortex and the corpus striatum. These are the two features, these are the two structures that is derived from the telencephalon. So telencephalon, two telencephalon are there, so these forms cerebral hemisphere on either side. Diencephalon, which is the central region, this diencephalon later forms the thalamus, hypothalamus optic stalk, pars nervosa of the hypophysis cerebri. So these are the areas which is derived from the diencephalon: thalamus, hypothalamus, optic stack, then part of the hypophysis cerebri or the pituitary gland. Both both the telan and diencephalon together forms a cerebral hemisphere. So prosencephalon forms the cerebral hemisphere. Meson has no change, no further subdivision that later formed the midbrain. Rhombencephalon divided into meton and myelin. From the meton, pons and the cerebellum derives. From the myelin, medulla oblongata derives. So after the myelencephalon, it is continuous with the central portion of the thin slender area of the neural tube, which is later forms a spinal cord. So metencephalon give rise to pons and cerebellum. Myelencephalon give rise to medulla oblongata, which is continuous with the spinal cord. So the hindbrain, the part of the hindbrain are pons, cerebellum, medulla oblongata. Part of the mesencephalon is the midbrain. Prosencephalon is a cerebral hemisphere. So these are the areas which is derived from different parts of the neural tube. When this neural tube develops, that consists of a cavity inside, and this cavity persists as such. This cavity later forms the ventricles. So the cavity inside the telencephalon, forms the lateral ventricle. Each brain has two lateral ventricles, one in this hemisphere and in the opposite hemisphere. Two lateral ventricles are there. Then space between the two diencephalon. When two cerebral hemispheres join together, the two diencephalons of the two cerebral hemispheres come close, and there will be a space formed between the thalamus. That forms another ventricle called the third ventricle. So this is lateral ventricle, and the space inside the diencephalon forms the third ventricle. Cavity of the midbrain is a narrow cavity which is called the cerebral aqueduct. Cavity of the hindbrain forms the fourth ventricle. So lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle. From the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, the passage is cerebral aqueduct, which is present in the midbrain. Ventricles are the spaces which is filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. Now we will see the brainstem. Brainstem consists of midbrain, pons, medulla. These are the three structures forming the brainstem. So before that, we'll make you familiar with the structures of the brain. Here, in this picture, you can see the superior surface of the cerebrum. This is a lateral view from the cerebrum. This whole thing is present inside the cranial cavity, in which this is the cerebrum. Below the cerebrum is a cerebellum, and this stalk-like structure called the brainstem. So this whitish stalk-like structure is called the brainstem. This is the cerebellum. This is a cerebrum. These are the whole structures which is present inside the cranial cavity. Now, again in this picture, you can see this is the original picture showing the cerebral hemisphere, and this is the view from the medial surface of the cerebrum with a corpus callosum, which is joining the two cerebral hemispheres together. This is the area of the lateral ventricle, that is the ventricle of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the area of the diencephalon. Here comes the thalamus, here comes the hypothalamus. Thalamus, hypothalamus. So this area below the corpus callosum is the third ventricle and the diencephalon. Just above the diencephalon is a septum called the septum pellucidum, which is hiding the lateral ventricle. So while rupturing the septum, you can see the lateral ventricle. Now, this is the midbrain, this is the pons, this is the medulla. So these three structures together forms a brainstem. And now this structure below the cerebrum is called the cerebellum. So this is cerebrum, this is cerebellum, midbrain, pons, medulla. Together forms the brainstem. This is the area of diencephalon. This is nothing but the corpus callosum, and this is the area of the lateral ventricle. So while taking the brainstem, We know brainstem consists of three parts: a midbrain, pons, and a medulla. In this picture, you can see this is the area of the midbrain, this is a pons, and this is a medulla. Behind the pons and medulla, there is cerebellum. The picture of cerebellum. Now we'll see how does the brainstem look like. This is the posterior surface of the brainstem. Here you can see area of the midbrain. This is area of the midbrain. This is area of the pons, and this area of the medulla. This view is from posterior aspect. These two structures are the thalamus. This is the thalamus in one cerebral hemisphere. This is the thalamus of the opposite cerebral hemisphere. So the posterior surface of the brainstem starts from this level. This is a midbrain, this is a pons, this is a medulla. From the posterior aspect, on the midbrain you can see four swellings: 1, 2, 3, 4. They are called colliculus, which is a characteristic feature to be identified in the midbrain on its posterior surface. From anterior aspect, you can see this is the midbrain, the crest of the midbrain. This is the pons, and this is the medulla. This cerebellum, this is another cerebellum. Cerebellum is also two in number in the sense they have two cerebellar hemispheres, same like that of cerebrum. Cerebrum is also having cerebral hemispheres. Same way, cerebellum is consisting cerebellar hemispheres. Now we will see the features of the midbrain. It is the first part of the brainstem and it's having just 2 centimeter. It has two halves, right and left, and these halves are called cerebral peduncles. Anteriorly, there is a fossa between the peduncle called the interpeduncular fossa. Posteriorly, midbrain has 4 swellings, a pair of superior colliculus above and a pair of inferior colliculus below. So the new terms that you have to be identified and studied. The first term here is a cerebral peduncle. So what is cerebral peduncle? Cerebral peduncle are the two halves of the midbrain. If you're taking the section of the midbrain, cross section of the midbrain, you can see this is the section through the midbrain. Here it is very well defined. It is very clear that this is one half and this is another half. In between the two halves there is a space. So this half, this right half and this left half are called cerebral peduncles. This is one cerebral peduncle, this is another cerebral peduncle. So midbrain consists of two halves. Each halves are called cerebral peduncle. So each peduncle starts from here till this is a anterior aspect and this is a posterior aspect. Between the peduncles there is a fossa called interpeduncular fossa. Now, interpeduncular fossa is present in the anterior surface or anterior aspect, but posteriorly, what we can see is midbrain consists of 4 swellings. This is one swell, this is a pair of swelling. Same like that, below there is another swelling. That is what we can see in this picture. While viewing the midbrain from behind, we can see 4 swellings: 1, 2, 3, 4. A pair of superior colliculus and a pair of inferior colliculus. So what we can see anteriorly is interpeduncular fossa and the crus. Now, if you're seeing the internal features, the cavity of the midbrain is called the cerebral aqueduct that we already had seen, cerebral aqueduct. Surrounding the cerebral aqueduct is a gray matter. Part in front of the aqueduct is called tegmentum. Beyond the tegmentum, there is a grayish colored pigmented area called substantia nigra. In front of the substantia nigra is a crus cerebri. Part behind the cerebral aqueduct is called tectum. Tectum consists of superior and inferior colliculus. I'll explain once more. The cavity. Now we are going to describe the internal features of the midbrain. Internally, by looking internally, we can see there is a cavity inside. That cavity is nothing but the cerebral aqueduct. We already have described about the different ventricles present in different parts of the neural tube. So while explaining that, I have told you this midbrain consists of a narrow passage which is called the cerebral aqueduct. This is the cerebral aqueduct. Surrounding the cerebral aqueduct is a gray matter. in front of the gray matter. The part in front of the gray matter is called a tegmentum. This is a tegmentum of the right side, this is of the left side. In front of the tegmentum, there is a pigmented area called a substantia nigra. In front of the substantia nigra is called an area which is called a crus cerebri. So, whole area is called a crus peduncle, but the anterior part is called a crus cerebri. So, these are the features: cerebral aqueduct, gray matter, tegmentum, substantia nigra and crus cerebri. New terms you have to identify, and these new terms you have to write and study. The part behind the cerebral aqueduct is called tectum. Tectum is the part where you can see the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. And this is a structure, this is a section through the level of superior colliculus. The cranial nerve, which is seen associated with the midbrain, are the third and fourth cranial nerve. At the superior collicular level, the tegmentum consists of a large red colored mass called red nucleus. That is visible here. I have told you this is a section through the superior collicular level. We can make section at two levels, at the level of superior colliculus and at the level of inferior colliculus. While taking the section through the superior collicular level, the tegmentum consists of two red colored mass of gray matter, which is called a red nucleus. Now, the cranial nerves which is attached to the midbrain are the third and fourth cranial nerve. First and second cranial nerve are present in the cerebral hemisphere itself. Third and fourth to the midbrain. Now we will see the pons. It is a middle part of the brainstem. It is related to the functions of hearing, taste and balance. So these are the functions which is attributed to the pons. Hearing, taste, balance. It is about 2.5 centimeter long. It has two surfaces, a ventral surface and a dorsal surface. Ventral is the anterior, dorsal is the posterior. And this is how the pons look like while taking section through the pons. This is a ventral surface and this hole is a dorsal surface. It consists of two borders, a superior border and inferior border. Ventral surface is convex in both directions. It has a groove in midline called basilar groove. It gives attachment to fifth cranial nerve. Dorsal surface of the pons is covered by cerebellum. It forms floor of the fourth ventricle. Pons also gives attachment to 6, 7, 8 cranial nerves. Now we will see this is the anterior aspect of the pons, the gross structure of the pons. It consists of an anterior surface and behind is a posterior surface. That is not visible from this picture. Anterior surface is visible here. Now it has a superior border and an inferior border. Superior border related to the midbrain, inferior border related to medulla. In the anterior surface, the midline, the middle of the anterior surface consists of a groove or a sulcus called groove for the basilar artery. And this is called a basilar sulcus. Basilar sulcus. Basilar sulcus consists of basilar artery. Now, the structure, the pons gives attachment for the fifth cranial nerve. So this fifth cranial nerve is called a trigeminal nerve, which is attached to the pons. Then it also gives attachment to 6, 7, 8 cranial nerves. 6th cranial nerve, 7th cranial nerve, 8th cranial nerve. But this is attached to the pons at the junction between pons and medulla. 5th is attached more towards the exact anterior surface of the pons. We are looking from behind. The pons forms the floor of the fourth ventricle. It is an opened part which is forming the floor of the fourth ventricle. Now, the total length of the pons is 2.5 centimeter, and we will see what are the structures present internally in the pons. Internally, ventral portion is called the basilar part, dorsal part is called tegmental part. This is an internal structure. This is how the pons look like while taking the section. This is the ventral portion, this is the dorsal portion. Dorsal portion is called tegmentum. This is a tegmental area. Tegmental area consists of numerous cranial nerve nuclei. So it presents the cranial nerve nuclei of the 5, 6, 7, 8. Then this area, this tegmental area consists of the nuclei called the pontine nuclei. This small pontine nuclei. This is given in green color. These are the pontine nucleus, and this is corticospinal tract. So all the descending tracts passes through the anterior part of the pons, and the ascending tracts passes through the posterior part. Now we will see the features of the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata is the last portion of the brainstem. It is about 3 centimeter long, continues down as a spinal cord. Anteriorly along the midline, medulla has a median fissure and a posterior median sulcus. On either side, anterior median fissure, there is an elevation called pyramid, which is formed by the pyramidal tract or the corticospinal tract. Lateral to the pyramid, there is another elevation called olive. Olive is formed due to the underlying inferior olivary nucleus. Lateral to the olive, inferior cerebellar peduncle is present. The medulla gives attachment to 9, 10, 11, 12 cranial nerves. We'll see the last portion of the brainstem. This is a medulla, this is a pons, this is a medulla. Medulla consists of an anterior median fissure, a deep sulcus present in the anterior median aspect called anterior median fissure. On either side of the anterior median fissure, which is given in yellow color, is an elevation. This is one elevation, and on the other side another elevation, and this elevation is called a pyramid. How does the pyramid form? Pyramid is just a surface elevation present on either side of the anterior median fissure, and this pyramid is formed due to the presence of underlying descending tract. A tract is passing under the elevation. So that tract is called the corticospinal tract or pyramidal tract. So this elevation is formed by the pyramidal tract. Now, lateral to the pyramidal tract or lateral to the pyramid, in the upper part, there is another elevation which is given in the green color on either side. This is called olive. So it is present only in the upper part, not like the pyramid, it is not extending towards the lower part. It is present only in the upper region, and this is called olive. The olive is due to the presence of underlying inferior olivary nucleus. So inferior olivary nucleus is the structure which is present under the olive. Olive is just a surface projection. While we are opening this area, we can see a nucleus underlying this. That is called the inferior olivary nucleus. More lateral to this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. More lateral to this, another elevation present which is called inferior cerebellar peduncle. This inferior cerebellar peduncle is a peduncle, is a structure which is connecting the medulla with the cerebellum. Total length of the medulla is 3 centimeter. Now we'll turn the medulla posteriorly to see what are the structures present over there. Posteriorly, you can see two elevations. This is the posterior part of the medulla. Start from this line. So upper part of the posterior surface is open, but lower part is closed. Here it is widely open, and that forms the floor of the fourth ventricle along with the posterior surface of the pons. But lower part of the medulla is closed, and it consists of a posterior median sulcus. On either side of the sulcus, a pair of elevations present. This is one, this is another. Same like that on the opposite side, this is one, this is another. So a pair of elevations are present on either side of the posterior median fissure or posterior median septum, and these elevations are due to the presence of underlying ascending tracts, and these ascending tracts are called fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis. Gracilis medially, cuneatus laterally. So this elevation is called fasciculus gracilis, and this is called fasciculus cuneatus. These are the two elevations present on the posterior surface. So that is about the brainstem. So brainstem consists of midbrain, pons, medulla, and we'll see the midbrain cranial nerves attached to the midbrain are third, fourth cranial nerves. On the pons, we can see 5, 6, 7, 8. On the medulla, we can see 9, 10, 11, 12. So these are the areas of attachment of the cranial nerves. And you will see the different features of the brainstem. Thank you.